I have never thought of it that way. How to have furiously courageous conversations in dangerously divided times. If that sounds familiar to you, then you know who our next guest is. We've got on my friend, an amazing human, and just someone that is bringing a lot of light, a lot of curiosity to the world, Monica Guzman, who's also the senior fellow at Braver Angels and the author of the book that I just named, and also hosts a Braver Way podcast, which you should absolutely check out because this podcast is about having these conversations with guests and me sharing my thoughts. On that show, Monica brings on some amazing and interesting folks to actually listen to each other, to engage, and you'll hear from everyday Americans who just have some fascinating thoughts and perspectives. And most importantly, the reason I wanted to bring Monica back on is because the show has now been running for a year, which is amazing. And I appreciate all your support and the folks that are listening to this. Remember, every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content, that's where the hopeful majority is. And Monica is one of my favorite thinkers of the moment. She really causes us to think about and helps me think through how to be curious, how to be open-minded, how to actually talk to someone that you disagree with, especially when it's incredibly difficult and, as we said in the beginning, in dangerously divided times. If any of those questions resonate with you, how do I have a conversation? How do I listen? How do I engage? How to be curious when I don't want to be curious? This episode is for you. There's no monologue at the start of this. We're going to go straight into the conversation with Monica because, man, the conversation's always an exciting one. You're in for a good show, and I'll catch you at the end. Monica, welcome back to the Hopeful Majority.
Hey, Manu. Hello. How are you? Good to be here. And all that.
It's been a year. It's been a year.
Yeah. I can't believe it's been a year. How has it been a year? How
So
is all this moving so fast?
So just for the audience's context, and you're obviously one of the favorite guests of the Hopeful Majority, but when you and I were just catching up, we were talking about how usually this time in the day is for our personal time and personal catch up,
Mhm.
but it seems like both of our lives are getting increasingly busy, and so we're being forced to catch up on a podcast.
Yep. I mean, look at what's going on out there, you know? There's just no
So,
time to waste.
well, let me ask you this. So, um, since we last spoke, it feels like the demand for what we talk about and what we're focused on, this idea of curiosity, engaging, listening to people, civic dialogue, to me at least, it feels like in the last year, the demand has only increased.
Mhm.
For the first 4 or 5 years, I feel like I'm doing this work. I feel like we're toiling away, at least I was toiling away in obscurity, being like, hey,
Mhm.
we should have dialogue, we should have conversations. And people are
Yeah.
like, why do you need dialogue and conversations? And
Mm.
I mean, with your success and the growth of this show, the Braver Way show, with the growth of our organizations, it seems like there's growing demand. Do you feel that at all? Like when you're going around?
Absolutely. And from so many different places. So the A Braver Way podcast, which I host, the amount of traction that we picked up after we launched in late October and about to launch season 2,
Hmm.
that's one signal. But it's also, as you know, I've been traveling the country like you have and going to a lot of colleges, civic organizations, churches, communities, you name it. And the urgency and intensity with which people are asking the questions about the dialogue and about how to fit it into their lives, that has gone up.
Hmm.
And I mean, it's obviously got something to do with the fact that we are creeping closer to this giant black hole in our calendar in the fall of 2024 that so many people have so many swirling, stormy thoughts and feelings about. So that's clearly a thing. Even last year, this time last year, people were talking about the election and the fact that it's kind of in the background and it's just getting clearer and clearer and approaching and approaching and approaching.
Hmm.
So that's a big, big part of it. But even without that, there are so many organizations and so many people who are getting more visible and active out there talking about what dialogue really means. Um, and all of it, including you. So yeah, it's this is good. This is good that people are
Hmm.
the one thing we more of us seem to agree on across the political divide, right? Is not just that things are broken, but that the way to fix it has something to do with learning how to actually talk to each other.
Hmm. So why do you think that the desire to have those conversations has grown as we approach this like impending black hole that is the election, because a lot of people I remember last year were saying that as we get more and more divided, people are going to want to fight more. They're going to be less curious. They're going to be less interested in talking and listening to the other side. It seems like what you're saying is counter to that. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, I see the disengagement piece. I see
Yes.
that in a couple of places. I'm
Hmm.
a journalist, so I follow the conversation within media circles, and there's been rising and rising talk about news fatigue, how stressful news is in and around elections. I've noticed in a lot of my life, but also the circles beyond, where something about this presidential race, there are some people who are just like, wake me up when it's over. Just I don't need to follow every single blip because it's just gotten so intense and it's not good for me. So there is some level of that where disengagement appears to be the answer, but I don't think it's disengagement because people don't care or because people don't believe that engaging in any way is going to work. I think it's disengagement because the stress of it all makes it even harder to imagine a hopeful way forward, a good way forward. I see a lot more people trying to pull away from so much consumption and being consumed by everything that's going on, like all of that nonstop energy. Um, and I think I actually see a silver lining in that, which is the less time you spend following every single new development in the election or the race, the more time you could spend choosing to check in with real people about this stuff that you otherwise would just hear secondhand judgments about, right? So I've always believed that the ratio needs to change, where, of course, we need to have people telling the stories, summing things up, giving us the news about where people are at. But we know from the last several years that that in itself is just simply not enough. And we have to check in with real people. So that becomes really, really important.
Do you ever feel the pull of disengagement yourself? And do you ever want to like crawl under the covers and be like, this is crazy and insane? Like how do you battle that as a person? Because I'm sure people that are listening to this, they're like, this is exhausting and tiring. And I don't think that's a fake feeling at all. I think that's real.
Yeah.
How do you challenge that in yourself?
Yeah, I do see it in myself from that place that I was trying to articulate where I
Hmm.
have personally disengaged with the the daily ups and downs, the daily tick 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 of every single development going on. 4 years ago, 8 years ago, that was me. That was me watching every single thing, feeling a kind of pride in being the person among my group of friends who knew every last detail about every single event going on. Nowadays, I mean, I'm a journalist. I think it's really important to be informed, and I am. I am checking in at a certain level, but going too deep, I have seen for myself personally, is not helpful.
Hmm.
It takes up a lot of my time. It does stress me out. It doesn't come with enough solutions reporting. It doesn't come with enough roadmap, goals about what we can do. It's so polemical that it takes away my capacity to find my own agency. And so
Hmm.
I don't want that. That's the point that's too far for
Hmm.
me. And so I think I'm closer to a happy medium, if you will, right? So I'm following, I'm tracing what's going on, but not to the level of feeling consumed by it. Instead, it's more about it's more about. Because look, where we've been disengaged for too long is what other people around us actually think. We've
Hmm.
taken too many shortcuts. We've
Hmm.
accepted too many assumptions, secondhand, and I think that's part of what's hurt us. I've really internalized this.
Hmm.
So I am happier this year than I thought I would be because of the amount of time that I am spending talking to real
Wow.
people about this stuff.
That's fascinating that you're happier this year. I would actually, so one thing I want to underscore there, and when
Mhm.
I hear you say that it's a choice about what you consume, how much you consume, and the way in which you're consuming it, I see it as almost like this information diet, right? It's like
Mhm.
if the only thing I ate all day was just junk food, then I would feel really
Yeah.
crappy. And then alternatively, if I balance it out, there's value there.
Exactly.
How do you find the valuable crumbs in the sea of information that is out there? How do you know where to look? How do you balance the desire to be informed with the fact that it's too much if you're always zoned in on it, because oftentimes it's just junk food and it's not actually
Yeah.
informing.
It is. My main thing is I try to have this internal radar always on around why something catches my attention. So I'm always asking why. Ooh, I just felt a little ooh reading that headline. Why? You know, and sometimes the answer is it spoke to my inner partisan warrior. And if
the
that's
the
the
samurai is coming out.
right, it's like it spoke to that warrior and that warrior wants to click on it and wants to read it 5, 10, 15 minutes. Sometimes it's I already know the event. I already know what happened. And there's this curiosity that is egotistical and wants to be fed with affirmation. And that I recognize as this little beast that wants to go, I I have predictions. I have predictions about how people feel. Let me go find evidence that
Mhm,
that's the way they
mm,
feel in these sort of petty superficial ways. And so I there's a check, in my brain of like, no, no, no. Why are you reading the fourth article about the same thing? What are you looking for? Well,
mhm,
I'm looking to affirm. I'm looking to see who else might react the way I do. I'm looking for my ego to be fed by that. And
mm,
so there's a point, that point comes sooner and sooner where I go, I don't need that.
mm,
Why do I need that? I'm
mm.
already informed about what happened. What do I really need to go and look for, feed me tasty morsels of,
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
this sort of dopamine rush stuff, that only helps me dig my own trench into something, but
yeah.
not in a very credible way. So that's one thing is I try to leave the internal radar on for, "Is this actually useful?" "Is this interesting, or is it just feeding some emotional need?"
Uh-huh,
And if it
uh-huh.
is, then be
It's
choosy
almost
about that.
this is gonna sound so weird, but it sounds like you don't wanna be a masochist for partisanship.
Right,
And and, like
yeah.
and it's like uh, and on top of that, I mean, you've got a following on social media. I see this oftentimes with the podcast. The algorithm and the way in which you get traction and influence inevitably mean that you want to be feeding that partisan bug, because
Right.
oftentimes when you know where the partisan
Yes.
radar is, then you're like, boom, I hit that thing. I'm going to read the fifth article on this. I'm going to talk about it because they said something stupid here.
Yep.
And now I know that that's actually going to get me money.
Yeah. I'm trying to do
Right.
the opposite, Manu. So, one
Thank you.
thing that I've started doing is I'm a lot less, interested. At least the thoughtful part of me that isn't reactive, when I can load that part of me, is a lot less interested in all the affirmations, continuing to dig in the things that I can already kind of be familiar with. But the place where in media I get really interested is precisely, wait a minute, what's a really good, interesting, interactive story or video that is non judgmental, that is presenting me with what my fellow Americans are thinking? And when
Mm,
it comes non judgmentally, when it comes curiously, you can tell. You can tell by the presentation of it. And I'll say, you can find this sometimes in what you might consider to be partisan media, or you can find it, in something that you might consider to be more objective. It's a marker. You can look for the signs. Look at the headline. Is the headline already judging?
mm,
Avoid
mhm.
it. Avoid
Yep.
it. Try to find the ones that are trying to dispassionately just pass something on to you, right?
Mm,
Here's what your fellow Americans are thinking. Here's their reactions to this or that or the other thing. But anyway, and what I love is to look for those things in surprising places. So because I'm liberal, I have, like, over time, over this last year in particular, accumulated some more red-leaning media sources that I really respect and I learn a lot
mhm.
from. And so those have been super cool for me. Really,
Are
really
there are there any examples that you'd share with the audience? Any
um,
sources in particular that you like?
yeah, I mean, let's see, gosh, I mean, and some of these aren't even how red or how conservative they
Yeah.
are is
Yeah.
questionable, but
Of
they're at
course.
least not mainstream left, I
Yep.
suppose.
Yep. Yep.
The Christian Science Monitor,
Sure.
the Deseret News, Reuters is known for being more or less trusted, than some other folks. So there's
Mhm.
those guys. But then on the right, the Dispatch is really interesting.
Mm.
Compact Magazine is really interesting. That's populism across the political divide. So interesting to me.
Mhm.
So I've caught essays in there that I didn't even know existed.
Mhm.
And they're making me think and they're
Yeah.
challenging my ideas. So that one's really cool. The free press has
Yeah.
been, known as being sort of a response to some of the things on the left, but the right has grown to trust the free press as well in really interesting ways. So
Mm.
that's really cool. And then I have my news aggregators, the flip side that you
Yep.
know about, Anafi Wahed and others who do amazing work, and that's a curating newsletter, one political issue per weekday, the best thinking on the left, the best thinking on the right. And they really mean it. They're actually looking for the steel man best argument. And I cannot tell you how many sparks fly in my brain when I
Mm.
read those. So that's how I know how many sparks fly in my brain. How often do I feel my ideas, my assumptions challenged? Because if I'm
Huh.
reading media and it's just affirm, 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 then I'm just feeding my ego. There's something I'm feeding and there's nothing I'm learning. Do you know what I mean?
And here's the secret, I think, which is us as consumers should know that the media headline that you click on, right? You said that if you
Mhm.
click on the crazy thing, the newsroom is actually going to be incentivized to write more of that, right?
Exactly.
Because it's their economic model. And so it's almost like, you know how they say vote with your feet? It's like you're voting with your click, right?
Yeah.
And you're choosing how to consume. So
Yep.
I want to take this conversation in a slightly different direction. This is what I actually wanted to start the conversation with, but then my ADD kicked in. I went a little crazy. So so over the last year, you hosted season 1 of your podcast, A Braver Way. And if folks haven't checked out, I think it's fascinating. And unlike this show, you're talking to everyday Americans on different issues, and you actually get to see real differences, real conversations. You get to hear the stories.
Mhm.
Over this process of hosting season 1, and you've seen sort of the sparks in your brain fly as you have these different conversations, what would you say you've learned through the journey? What is something that maybe you didn't know that
Mm.
you picked up on, and that you're like, you know what, this is a new insight
Mm.
that I want to bring after hosting that first season.
Well, see, here this is the secret is like, I don't know, sometimes I feel kind of selfish, like I'm cheating because every episode of A Braver Way, is at least partially motivated by, I am dying to hear more from this person. I
Yeah.
need to understand this or that really interesting kernel of what in the middle of their story. So all the episodes have done that. So there's sparks and insights every single one.
But that's the
Ah,
best show. That's a great indicator that you're doing a good show, which where it's like you're like, I would want to listen to my own show.
like, no, exactly. And here's what's funny is because A Braver Way is edited, right? So
Uh-huh.
I record for people for sometimes over an hour, but what you hear is the best 25 to 30 minutes.
Mhm.
So I hear back the interview and it's like it's almost like I wasn't there and I'm learning it. I mean, I've reheard episode 5 of season 1 like
Okay.
5 times and I pick up something new every time. And that's with
What
Luis
was that episode
Mojica.
about?
It's with Luis Mojica. He's a somatic
Okay.
therapist and he has extraordinary strategies about how to notice your own reactions and what it means to actually, when we talk about safety, I feel safe, I don't feel safe. Biological safety. He talks about biological safety and amazing insights, like things like the profundity of a question that I've really held on to. And the question being, why is this idea safe for you, but it isn't safe for me? And
Mhm.
what that question allows you to do is in any disagreement, you can play detective even if there is that sense of threat from the idea, right? Anyway, that's just one insight.
Mm.
But then,
Well,
yeah.
let me just ask you something on that, which
Mhm,
is you said that you record an hour long, sometimes conversations that go longer than an hour, and
mhm,
you trim them down to 25 minutes. I
mhm,
want to ask you this question as a fan, right? As
mhm,
someone that's curious, how do you decide what is the best content? And
mm.
and how do you build this sense of trust with your audience as a journalist, as someone that's exploring the subject, that you're actually presenting the content in a truthful, honest way that is real? Because I think that's a curiosity that a lot of people have when they're consuming content. So how do you go through that process? What are you looking for?
Yeah, I mean, that's where I wish I had, my senior producer, David Albright, is a
Uh-huh.
genius. I'm
Go
so
David.
lucky that he's on our team. He told me the other day, like, "I love perfecting conversations," and I was like, "I love that you love it too."
This is how you know this is a nerd fest.
It is awesome. So he's really the brilliant, person behind it all,
Okay.
but he and I talk strategy all the time. part of it is that each episode of A Braver Way is focused on what we call the driving question. So each episode has a driving question. So episode 5 of season 1, which I talked about with Luis Mojica, the driving question is, how do you handle being triggered? So in the
Mm,
edit, whatever back and forth wasn't really strongly getting to a story or building momentum around that question gets cut, right?
mhm, mhm.
And often some of the best material comes in toward the end because, as you know, the beginning is sometimes a warm up, and
Yeah.
sometimes that warm up is leading you up the mountain to the most amazing insights. Sometimes it's leading you on an off ramp. So you don't need it necessarily if you want to give the listener a really compelling experience.
How do you decide what's your driving question?
Mhm. Oh, it's fun. Um,
Like,
we
what makes a good driving question?
I mean, it's gotta be something that feels like a lot of people are wrestling with. In season 2, one episode, the driving question is, and you and I have talked about this one a lot, how can I engage with someone who thinks I shouldn't exist? And the guest we picked for that, and I don't wanna give it away, but boy, she's incredible. She's incredible, Manu. I cannot wait to air that episode. There's another driving question. How how can I speak fully and freely to spaces that are hostile to my views? That's another one that's
Mm,
huge. So the first one I mentioned is one that I see as a deep insecurity on the left,
mhm,
and the second one is a one that I see as a deep insecurity on the right. But really in some ways they're very similar. They're
mm,
very similar. It's about exclusion in one way or another. So
mm.
there's a lot of ways that people on both sides are asking the same questions. They just don't recognize them in each other.
Right, right.
So part of A Braver Way is helping layer those things one on top of the other, but not by just saying it outright, but by presenting real stories and real people who live that overlap somehow. And I know that seems like cryptic, and it's again because I don't want to give too much away, but it's
Mhm.
these are really really great stories, and so the driving questions are very very important.
So
Um,
let's take that, and I want to ask you to get
mhm,
into the content because people should go check out The Braver Way.
mhm,
Um, but, like, let's take that question of how do you have conversations where someone believes that I shouldn't exist, right? The insecurity in the left.
mhm,
Um, how would you respond to that question?
mm,
Because I've seen I mean, your book speaks a lot to it, but
mhm.
having traveled the road of the last 2 years, I'm sure you've met people that have really challenged your notion of how to answer that question. So how do you think about that
Yeah.
question?
A million ways. Every time I get asked, it's like a pond with a lot of little fish swimming in it, and it's which I cast the net and which fish comes up. Right now, one thing that comes up is we often assume that engaging or across the divide or what have you, a disagreement requires an argument that's the form that engagement takes, that I need to argue, I need to argue for myself, I need to defend myself, and I need to somehow like learn from the other person, engage, be curious. um but I sometimes tell a story that I'll go ahead and share with you now.
Hmm,
um and sometimes it's really great to tell the stories I've collected from other people, and sometimes it feels right to tell my own story, and in this case it's my own story. So many, many years ago, I don't remember exactly, early 2010s in Seattle, I was sitting in a theater waiting for a friend.
mhm,
And somebody came by who was working in the theater. And I noticed they had really long earrings. And one earring said they, and the other earring said them, like these
mm,
dangling earrings with their pronouns, right? And I'd never seen that before. And I'm an elder millennial. So my generation is not as familiar with the we haven't spent as much time, as your generation with different ways of conceiving of gender and different all of this that's been happening with pronouns. So I noticed instantly discomfort in myself.
mhm,
Instant. Ah! you know? Now, granted, this person didn't say a word to me, right? In fact, they came up and said, "Oh, hi." And I said, "Oh, hi." And then they walked away. Okay? So, what happened at that point was a conversation between me and myself. And it lasted about 15 minutes. I was just sitting there with nothing else to do. And I was arguing with myself. And one side of me was like, I don't know about these pronouns, man. Like, what is this? What's going on? I don't get it. It makes me uncomfortable. And the other side was like, I can so understand why they would wear those earrings. I
Mm,
can understand why they would wear those earrings. They're looking to build a culture that accepts them. And here I am clearly provoked. And so, it was like an argument. It was an argument, me versus myself. By the end of that argument, Manu, I emerged more comfortable with they them pronouns than I was at the beginning. Now, what does this have to do with your question? How can I engage with someone who thinks I shouldn't exist? I think what it is that sometimes the best way to engage with people who think you shouldn't exist, or are uncomfortable with some piece about you, is to exist in their presence. You don't have to make an argument. You don't have to open your mouth. You know,
mm,
there is no one on this earth. When you think about, there's something that question does that I don't think is good. Um, that question seems to give somebody else the power of deciding whether something ought to exist. You know,
mm,
like when
mm,
you say, "I don't want to talk to someone who thinks I shouldn't exist," it's like you're saying, and the fact that they think you shouldn't exist means you shouldn't exist. Like,
mhm,
okay, what kind of power does that give them? What kind of power are you ceding to them in believing that that opinion even has relevance at all, right? So there's a kind of internal security that can
mhm,
come out of, wow, if someone's uncomfortable with me, that's their problem. You know?
mm,
Like,
yeah,
maybe that's not my problem, maybe that's their problem. And I'm gonna continue to exist because this is who I am. And there's gonna be a debate because that's who the world is.
mhm, mhm,
What are you gonna do? You can I mean, obviously safety, going back to Luis Mojica, you have to think about that, and there's lots of considerations there to think about. But do you wanna hide? Is that the right thing? I mean, you have a wonderful answer to this that you shared on A Braver Way once, right? Where you said, because if you reframe the question as, it's like, oh, what was it? What happens if you don't? I remember was your answer.
yeah, yeah,
How does
what
it
happens
go?
if you don't?
Remind me. Yeah.
Yeah,
What
it was
happens if you don't? Yeah, what? Like, what is that in response to again?
it's in response to, should we have when do we not have the conversation with people that we disagree with, right?
Mhm.
And rather than, I think, answering that question, I think the best response is
What
what happens
happens
if you
if you
don't
don't?
have that conversation? But
Exactly.
then I've been thinking about this actually, especially when you were just sharing this thought, right? Which is, I think it's a good question to ask, which is what happens if you don't? But how do you, I assume that it's not always the right time to have the conversation, right?
Correct.
Like it's like, if you're going to the gym, you're not going to the gym 24/7, right? You're going to the gym like maybe an hour a day. Um, how do you know when the time is right? Right? Because my contention with the current political climate is that the immediate knee jerk reaction is you don't have the conversation, which I don't think is right. I think you've got to have the conversation. But I think then it's on you and I to be able to also explain, okay, that makes sense. But when do you think it's not the right time?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, how
Yeah.
do you think about that? What would you say to that
Yeah.
question?
So this is I've been getting out ahead of this particular A Braver Way episode. I believe it's going to be episode 2 of season 2.
Okay.
But my friend Baratunde Thurston, who's
Yeah.
incredible, is our guest in that episode, and the way he puts it in there, I think, is really profound. We were talking about Daryl Davis, whom as this incredible Black blues musician who, long story short, has sort of listened actual Ku Klux Klan members out of their beliefs,
Mhm.
and has a collection of Ku Klux Klan robes that they have given him when they've realized that their hatred of Black people is just absurd and they've abandoned it. Anyway, and Baratunde said, that's Daryl Davis. My name is Baratunde Thurston. I'm not going to go talk to members of the Klan because that's going to do more to me than for me. And boy, I loved that. He took ownership of that. And I think that's the key thing. I think a lot of us are looking for socially consistent guardrails. My rule is your rule is your rule is your rule is your rule. Let's all agree on the rule. We won't talk to people who believe this, okay? Or this, or this, or this. Definitely not. Right, 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 right. It's like, no. Only you can know if a conversation is going to do more to you than for you. And only you can know when that flips. Because you can make some profound change in the world if you can talk to people who thoroughly disagree with you on something, even something really, really scary. Daryl Davis is like the most legendary example of that. So are we ready to rule that out? I know it's super hard, but are we all going to rule that out? So I think what that means is it's what Baratunde said is like he speaks from a place of great self-knowing. It's one of the things I really respect about him. Incredible self-knowing. So can we all get to that place of great self-knowing? And what I think that means is it's self-inquiry, because you'll never know yourself for all time. Everything's changing around you all the time. Everything in your heart and head is swirling all the time. You don't know when that moment comes when you can talk to not everybody, but this person about abortion, this person in this moment with this relationship right now. But not in that other moment, but maybe right now. So what that means is you have to keep it open, and you have to have it as an ongoing radar instead of doing what so many have done, which is build walls that can never fall, burn bridges that can never be crossed because they're gone. Let's not do that, because the only way to ensure that we can persuade each other is to burn the bridges that we have. And so if we want a better world with the ideas that we happen to think are the best ideas, guess what? They need to transmit. And we can't do that if we're burning relationships left and right, or burning our own agency in potentially having conversations we're afraid to have. Why would we do that? That's taking away our own power. Why would we do that?
What's the point of all this? Okay, so that might sound like an annoying question, but like you kind of got to it with this agency thing. But as I'm listening to you, I'm imagining someone in the audience sitting there and they're like, all right, these guys are they're just curiosity nerds.
Yeah.
Let I'm gonna be self-aware, self-know. Dude, I gotta go pay the grocery bill. I have to go to work. I don't have time to do any of this. And like I can sense someone having a defensive reaction to this. And like, what's the point? Like, why should I care?
Yeah.
Why should I take the time to go on your introspective journey? And the reason why I'm bringing some teeth to this is I'll tell you this, Imani. So I had a month ago, I had a reporter call me from the New York Times. I won't say his name, but there's a story coming out soon, right? And he called me and he said, so I'm writing about blah, 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 these organizations that are bridging differences. And he's like, yeah. So we go deeper into this conversation and he says, yeah, so I'm writing about this Kumbaya industrial complex. And I was like,
Wow.
so you see where I'm going with this?
I do.
So I'm writing about this Kumbaya industrial complex. And I don't know if that's going to make it into the piece or not. I have no idea if he was joking or not. But this, you know how like when someone says something and it's a deep insecurity you have and it really irks you?
Yeah.
Because what I critique a lot of the other folks for is the outrage industrial complex, that they're making money and attention off of outrage and trafficking. And he essentially alleged that there's this cottage industry of people out there that are like the Kumbaya nerds. So I know there's a lot there, but I can just hear the critics saying, what's the point?
Yeah.
And it feels like you guys are just performing your curiosity.
Yeah. I get it. I mean, and to some extent, hey, we've built organizations around it. We've built podcasts around it. Sure. Some of that has built up to the level of a thing, a brand, a stage, a movement, a group, an organization. Sure. But but what provokes me about dismissing it all as a kumbaya industrial complex is it really erases the much deeper level of things that we're all trying to access here, right? And
Mhm.
at the end of the day, it's like whether it's kumbaya or outrage is not the point and never was. The point is, can we actually see each other and each other's views clearly? Can we get to a level where we're able to just have basic communication that is uninterrupted by bias, assumptions, stereotypes, hatred, resentment? My God, you know? And if we're not capable of doing that ever, we're doomed. So to me, that's not kumbaya, that's not outrage. That's our democratic republic. That's the
Mhm.
experiment we're here to do, right?
Mm.
So I find like a much deeper thing. Episode 1 of A Braver Way, season 2, we go to history. We talk
Mm.
about Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. These are two guys, the very first partisan rivals in American history. They were vicious to each other. Vicious. We think that they're like sparkled with civility and they were like drinking tea and pound cake. No, they were awful to each other. Petty, and but they were also geniuses, and they put it all on the line during the Revolutionary War. They saw their friends die. They were
Mm.
building a nation. So somehow they argued with so much passion for what they believed, including that the other guy was super wrong about the best direction that this country should go in. And with the benefit of time looking back, it's extraordinary the gift they gave all of us just by staying in the arena. If one of them had said, "Forget this guy. I'm done. I don't
Mhm.
want to deal with it. Fine, he wins or whatever," or like if one of them had stepped out, America would have suffered. And
Mm.
it was one of the freshest, most hopeful things that I've taken out of any of these episodes is like we have to remember that while the outrage and the contempt is poison, the divisions, many of these divisions are real. Many of these disagreements are real. And the
Mm.
passion is not the problem.
Mm.
Arguing at the height of our intellectual rigor and ability is not the problem, right? We have to have people represent the best arguments everywhere. So that's important. Um, and they stayed in the arena. But the biggest thing I was going to say that story taught me was they were able to do it all for the good of the country, even though some of their interactions were poison, because they knew they were building this country. They knew
Mhm.
they were. And
Mhm.
sometimes I think we've forgotten that we are
Yes.
still building this country. So don't talk to me about outrage and kumbaya. That is not the point here, you know? Like, I
Hmm.
don't know. You and I have talked about this, and now I'm getting all worked up, but it's like,
Yeah.
I didn't.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
a you just I actually wanna, uh, underscore the last piece that you said, which is they were building this country, and then earlier you said that these conversations are a way to have agency, right?
Yeah.
And I was fumbling for my phone right now, and the reason was because I just read, today's D-Day for the audience's context, and
Oh,
so I read, I was just reading Mani right before we came on, a letter of a soldier that, passed away in or that was killed in World War II, and
mhm.
this was a letter he wrote right beforehand, and he ended this piece with saying, um uh, we of the United States have something to fight for. The USA is worth a sacrifice. And where this takes me is, do you
Yeah.
think there's a certain sense of patriotism and a love for country that is also required in these political conversations?
Yeah.
Because suddenly then they have the North Star for what we're actually aiming for.
Yeah.
Um, what do you think about that?
I'm so glad you asked that because that question is super alive for me right now. It's
Okay.
really deeply alive for me right now. Literally, my husband and I were walking home from a school event the other day for our kids, having this conversation because he and I both grew up going to schools in very different parts of the country, him in Texas, me in New Hampshire, doing the Pledge of Allegiance at the beginning of the day.
Hmm.
And I don't know who does that anymore. Certainly not my kids' schools. Um, They do land acknowledgments at the beginning of assemblies, right?
Really? They do
Yeah,
land, but not
I'm
at
in
least certain
Seattle.
schools,
I'm in
yeah, and
Seattle.
they do land acknowledgments, but
They
not
do land
pledges. Yeah.
acknowledgments at the beginning of their assemblies. Um, But as far as I know, no one's doing the Pledge of Allegiance, and it's very interesting. It's very interesting, that change, you know? Um, anyway, it's very alive for me as well because I have never been a lawn sign person. You know
Mhm.
how people have their lawn signs about, like, whether it's a campaign lawn sign or it's a "In this house we believe" lawn sign or a parody of the "In this house we believe" lawn sign. Like, it's a whole industry now. I have never been a lawn sign person, never had a single one. And I am close to wanting to put the American flag out in front of my house. You know, we don't have a flagpole. I don't think anyone in our street has a flag of any kind, but I want to put the American flag in front of a house.
Hmm.
And it's so interesting to me as someone who is not
Hmm.
I'm not a "let me show you my banners" type of person. Anyway, but it's because I and again, I'm just internally curious, like, why is this suddenly a desire for me? I've detected this desire, and I think it's kind of because of what you said.
Hmm.
It's like, I don't know that we can fix all of this without caring for it.
Hmm.
How do we do
Well,
it without caring
now
for it?
now we know that you're at least we know you're part of the lawn sign industrial complex. That's for real. I mean, I think that, when you think about the idea of putting up a flag, right?
Yeah.
And saying that there's a certain sense of I've got this desire for the country and that's why I'm going to have the conversation.
Mhm,
It my spin on this, I want to test this by you. This is something
mhm,
I talk a lot about because our students will say like, "Hey, should we have this like what's the point of this conversation? You know, why do you care? What's the point? The country's already all gone, right? To hell with it." And the phrase we use is like America's 250 years going to be 250 years old in 2026.
mhm,
250. I'm reading this book right now, Monty, called it's called the Power of Thrones, which the Game of Thrones
hmm.
is inspired from, and it's about the Middle Ages, right? The Middle Ages, right? This red book right here. The
Mm,
Middle Ages last for 1400 years,
yeah,
right?
it's a long
And
time.
within that, the Roman Empire before that lasts for 1,000 years.
Yeah,
Like we're not at the end of the American story, we're just getting started,
yeah.
right? And the phrase we use like we're in chapter 1, chapter 2. And it's like if you suddenly realize you're agents, you're pioneers, and you're early on, you got
Ugh,
to get going. You
exactly.
got to get going.
No, that's exactly
You're a
right, and
pioneer.
yeah, and, like, me geeking out, on Hamilton and Jefferson and frankly, all
Uh-huh.
the founding fathers. Washington, we're gonna do a little episode on Washington. It's just wow. It it's easy to forget how unbelievably revolutionary this republic is and was. It's really important,
Yeah. It
This
really
vision
is.
is really important and so cool. I wasn't even born here, and look at how I'm talking about this. Uh, so yeah, I just sometimes wish I wish we could just all look at the same thing for just a minute.
Hmm.
Can we all just look at that for just a minute? And can that
Mhm.
help us find we always talk about the search for common ground, right? And the search for common ground is about issues. No, no, no. Search for common ground just on what we're all doing here. Forget the issues. What are we doing here? We're coexisting. We have, those of us who were born here or came here, we have inherited a long struggle to try to create a society that works really well, better than a lot of societies that came before it. And look, I'm not all about like the United States, the greatest country. No, no, no,
Uh-huh.
no. I'm like that's not what I'm saying. But I do think there are things that this country has done and that people before us have
Mm,
done with great pains that is worthy of looking at and fighting for and being preserved. And that's
mm.
where I think my patriotism comes from. And even as I say the word patriotism, because I've been conditioned
Yes.
to be a good liberal, the word patriotism is supposed to be a little bit of a dirty word in some parts of the left. And I'm still feeling that. Like a patriot isn't able to look at the problems with a clear mind. A patriot isn't able to reevaluate history with the new lessons and learnings of today. And I say, of course we can.
Hmm.
Of course we can. What are you talking
Hmm.
about? Don't define that way for me. A patriot just has to love their country. A patriot does not have to accept it and not want to change it in any way. No. Like I love my kid and I'm helping them grow. And I don't know how I could tell my kid that something they're doing isn't serving them well if my kid didn't know I loved them.
Mhm.
So Anyway, so we're building this thing together, and that's where
That's
that's where
it,
my mind went today when you asked me the Kumbaya outrage
the k
question.
the Kumbaya industrial complex. Well, episode 3, we actually way back, this
Yeah.
was one episode before you actually, this was the episode right after the first time you were on,
Mhm.
and I asked the question, "What does it mean to love America?"
Right.
Because to your point, raising kids, like, admiration and critique are 2 sides of the same coin.
Exactly.
Because this is actually how okay, now we're going on a total tangent. Have you read the 1619 Project, like the book by any chance, or Nicole
No,
Hannah
not the
Jones'
full
story?
thing.
Okay.
I've wanted to, but
So
haven't.
so I picked it up and, like, I fully went through it, and
Mhm.
the first page, she starts off with a picture of her father, having an American flag in his lawn, and her asking, "Why do you have the American flag?" Because it goes to your point, as liberals, you
Mhm.
might be conditioned to critique patriotism, like, why are
Mhm.
you flying the flag?" The chapter ends with her saying that her father thought and believed
Mm.
that to him, Black Americans were at the core of the American struggle, and to be
Mhm.
patriotic meant the ultimate form of deep, loving critique.
Yeah.
And I think if you are on the left, that's a really interesting way to think about patriotism. And on the other hand, if you're on the right, loving a place also means trying to think about, well, what are its flaws and what are its challenges?
Yeah.
And yet, like, we live at this very polarized time, to your point, where you can't even have that level of nuance.
Yeah.
So here's the last thing I want to test out on you and I want to ask you about. I when we were prepping for this call, I've been ruminating with the idea of counterculture.
Mm.
And like, you always thinking about and pushing me and others on, like, here's how you can message this work more effectively, right? How do you prevent the kumbaya critique? And
Mm.
so we started thinking about the fact that dialogue at a time when everyone tells you to not have the conversation is
Mhm.
actually rebellious,
It
right?
is! Yes!
What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. When I was writing my book, I played with this line that I decided not to use. I was even gonna call a chapter,
What was it?
give it a curiosity is the real resistance. Because, the resistance was sort of this
Hmm.
thing from the left or what have you politically, after 2016, but yeah, curiosity is the real resistance. Like, and yeah, this is so yes, this is where I get very, very animated. The thing I believe that is really killing us most of all is when questions bubble up inside us that we feel we can't ask. Questions that would make everyone smarter, questions that would help a group open its eyes a little wider, especially a monocultural one ideology type of group that, by virtue of the fact that everyone thinks the same, is just making itself more siloed and in some ways dumber about the real issue. You
Mm,
can't, without some disagreement, without some friction, without some diversity of thought, it's it's too easy. It's too easy to subscribe to a too simple view of what something
mhm,
is really about. So that's what's killing us more than anything else, I think. So
mm,
from that view, curiosity is absolutely the real resistance. Not to mention, we all know, I think you know this, like I think a lot of us know this, that the most courage is required not to go up against the other side, but to go up against your own. That's where the most courage is actually required. Like all these people on social media getting all these points for making wonderfully constructed attacks against those imbeciles on the other side. Dude, it's so easy now. Come on, look around. It's just a show that takes courage anymore. That doesn't take courage. You're already like you've got your armies behind you, and who else are you even actually really reaching?
mm,
That's vanity. 'Cause that's a courage. Courage is people on their own side standing up to people on their own side who are making it harder for their own side to stay smart.
mm,
By overly excluding, by condescending, by sending poison and contempt and the kinds of things that make the actual goals of your side that much harder to achieve, because as we know, persuasion doesn't work through shame. It
mm,
doesn't even work through, people think it's all politics and it's all political war. It's like, sure, if you just wanna have a reactionary politics forever and ever, Like, that's a recipe for, oh, great, your side won. Congratulations. You managed to beat the margins by a little bit and get your party in power. Now your party's going to do what it wants. And then guess what? You're going to lose. And then the other party's going to undo everything you did. If we want to do that back and forth, I mean, I don't find that particularly compelling. So the only way to get out of the reactionary politics cycle is to make persuasion actually effective. And the only way to make persuasion actually effective is to make sure that there is communication that is sound among people with different ideas. It doesn't mean all of us have to do that. And people who are super one-sided and polemical and like always protesting and always sloganizing are part of a healthy democracy. It's about the balance. If too many of us do that and then almost none of us do the communication, we're doomed.
Curiosity is the real resistance. That's effing awesome. That's a sticker. That's gonna be the title of this episode. There you go.
There you go.
Duncan, we've got the title of the episode. Here's the last question I'd like to ask you, but you can take this anywhere you'd like, which is it within the last year since we last talked actually on the podcast, has there been a specific question that's come up from somebody that you've been speaking to or you've been in the audience that you found particularly challenging? Has there been a specific question or a line of critique against curiosity, against your work, against our collective work that you've been having a harder time wrestling with recently that you would like to share and think through?
Yeah. I mean, I've been thinking about this a long time. You and I have talked about this, barriers. I call it barriers. I have a digital notebook and I have so many notes under the heading
Yes.
barriers. Barriers people see. We talked about one of the hardest questions here. How do I engage with someone who thinks I shouldn't exist? Gosh.
Or is there like a specific barrier that like for I'll share on my side.
Yeah,
On my
please.
side, the election's coming up and people say I'm going to have curious conversations, I'm going to talk to people, but on November 4th, I'm going to be voting for somebody. And I know given polls that that chances are the American that I'm speaking with right now, because we're 50-50, is probably voting for someone different.
Mhm.
And when the election result is announced, how do I deal with the anxiety of the winner? And
Mhm.
and will the spike in anxiety on one side that's inevitable, will that overpower and break the ability for us to say we have to listen and engage?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
that's at least for me the one thing that I've been really struggling with.
Yeah. I mean, thank you, because where I relate to that, going back to your question, is it does feel like I've heard the barriers questions a lot in the
Yeah.
last year, and it's always a different answer, and the answers keep evolving. It's just there's so many responses to offer. There's no final answer to any of it. But this election does feel like the challenge this year, because we just don't know what's going to happen. We just don't know what's going to happen, and people are so afraid. I'll give you this sort of these two sides that I've just seen this week. So this past week, Trump was convicted of falsifying business records, as you know, and that night I did an event. I did a live public event, where I had a Q&A and everything with a lot of
Mm.
people. And toward the end of the Q&A, somebody raised their hand and got the microphone and said, I understand that you're talking about speaking to people who have a lot of differences and all of that, but she says, I'm just telling you right now, I am never going to talk to somebody who supports Trump. Not after what happened today. It's just not going to happen. These people are not educated and all of that, right? All of that. And this after I talked about my own parents, who have voted for Trump and will again, and everything. And so that was really challenging, and you felt the tension in the room go up and up and up. And I was told that what I managed to offer in response, which I can't possibly say verbatim now because it was very of the moment, but anyway, was helpful and good, and that room was certainly like very kind of tense to see what I would say to that. Just yesterday, yesterday I had I did a phone call to prepare for the Braver Angels convention coming up in Kenosha, Wisconsin, in the end of the month, and on that call was someone who was talking about they are conservative. Well, they're libertarian, and they were probably always going to vote for Trump, but he said, especially after the Alvin Bragg incident, I am definitely voting for Trump.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Like, you cannot talk me out of it now. Right? So because of the conviction, I'm definitely voting for Trump. Oh, and by the way, the woman at the event who raised her hand and said, I'll never talk to someone, who supports Trump, her husband got the mic next after her, started tearing up, Manu. And he
Mm.
started talking about, I remember where I was the day JFK was assassinated. I remember where I was, this and that Berlin Wall coming down. And he's like, I'll never forget where I was today when this man got the conviction, right? So these are examples of people who went clear one direction and clear the other direction from the same exact event.
Wow.
I mean, right?
So
And
that to me is the challenge.
yeah, I think we're going to see more and more of that probably this year.
Mhm.
But the most important thing is for people in those positions to see each other. That's
Mhm.
the most important thing.
Yes.
We're gonna think that it's about, and I mean, I'm not saying it's not about also arguing about what's actually going on. Like, let's look at events with clear eyes as far as we can. But it's like we've dug such deep trenches that I think the best way to get to truth, capital T truth, about all this stuff, these candidates and what's right and wrong, all that, the fastest best way is going to be not to take a good hard look at the issues, but a good hard look at each other. We have to see this. We have to see this mirror image thing that's happening first. I just believe that it's time to look at people. Let's look at people. We haven't been doing that. We've been turning away from people in so many ways, and technologies and AI are making it even easier to do that. Like, me and my daughter were talking to ChatGPT in the car and having a great time. Like, we we need to talk to people, you
Mm.
know? Um so anyway, that to me feels like in some ways the biggest barrier, because if we don't see what this is doing to us, I,
I'm smiling not because I'm so excited by the world image that you've just painted, but because it's just it's always a pleasure to spend time with you. I know that when we last spoke, and we had a great time hanging out in Chicago.
yeah.
And I remember that one of your resolutions, one of your focus points right now is being very intentional with your time
Mhm.
and prioritizing what matters most to you. And so I don't take it at all for granted that
Mm.
even though we're friends and we're close, coming on, taking an hour out and really sharing some of your thoughts and what you're thinking about. Um so thank you. Um and and as I said in this article, what we're doing is a middle finger to how effed up our politics is.
Yes. It is.
Thank you.
Curiosity is the real resistance. This is the fight right here. It's not kumbaya. Are you kidding? No. This if it were kumbaya, come on. Would people be this scared? Would people
Yeah.
be this scared if it was kumbaya, Manu? No.
When does well, I guess a Braver Way launch is intermittent and uncertain, but it's coming out soon.
It's coming out very
Season 2.
soon. It's coming out very
Se-
soon. Stay tuned. We're working on
okay.
some stuff behind the scenes that I wish I could talk about, but I can't. But it
Yeah.
means that our launch date is not it's not firm yet. But
But be on the
good things
lookout. Braver
happening.
Way, they can find it Apple,
Mhm.
Spotify.
Where all your favorite podcasts are found. Uh, find wherever your favorite podcast is found, you can find A Braver Way. And we already have a couple of pre-launch episodes up that I'm super proud of. They're only 10 minutes long. Check them out. They're fun.
Check them out, people. Thanks for coming on the show,
All right.
Mani.
Thank you, Manu. This was awesome.
Well, thank you so much to Monica for joining the show. I always appreciate your time. I appreciate everybody here for listening. Remember, this would not be possible without you. And that conversation was jam packed with some interesting thoughts, interesting ideas, and just great tactics and tools for how to actually have those dialogues. And if you appreciated it, I'll see you next week, because every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content, that's where the hopeful majority is. And if you could like and subscribe on YouTube, if you leave a review on Spotify or Apple, remember that's how we build the hopeful majority. And that's what we talked about last episode. That the real divide in our politics is not between the left and the right, but between the temperamentally extreme and the temperamentally moderate. And it's up to us, the temperamental moderates, to make our voices louder and engage. I'll catch you next week.